Hello, in this session I will be discussing the subject of administrative rule making or delegated legislation. Today, in all democratic countries, only a relatively small part of total legislative output emanates directly from the legislature. The bulk of the legislation is promulgated by the executive and is known as delegated legislation. The objectives of the session are to understand the concept and definition of delegated legislation, examine need and importance of administrative lawmaking, study the constitutional limits on delegation of legislative power, and list control mechanism operating at the point of exercise of delegated legislative power. Let us first see what is delegated legislation. Delegated legislation, also referred to as secondary, subordinate or subsidiary legislation, is law made by a person or body other than the legislature, but with the legislature's authority. Thus, it is the law made by administration and is generally expressed as rules, regulations, orders, schemes, bylaws, memorandum, order, etc. The powers are given to them by primary legislation or statute in order to implement and administer the requirements of that primary legislation. Often a legislature passes statute setting out the broad outlines and principles and delegate authority to the executive branch to issue delegated legislation that flesh out the details. Let us first examine why we need delegated legislation. Why can't we use primary legislation in the first place to run the government? The legislature being overburdened and the needs of modern day society being complex, it is not possible for the legislature to direct this giant machinery effectively. Therefore, the power to formulate rules has to pass from the parliament to the government officers and a series of semi-autonomous boards and commissions. Delegated legislation permits utilization of experience of administration and consultation with the interests affected by the practical operation of statute. The process also saves times and is able to deal with local variations. Further, it is not possible to foresee every administrative difficulty and emergent situation that may arise after the statute has begun to operate. Delegated legislation fills those needs as well. Now, the next thing to be examined is what is the constitutional limit on delegation? How much power should the legislature be permitted to delegate? Consistent with their sovereign character, legislatures in India have been held to possess wide power of delegation. This power is, however, subject to one important constitutional limitation. The legislature cannot delegate uncanalized and uncontrolled powers. The power delegated must not be essential legislative functions, which consistent in the determination of the legislative policy and of formally enacting that policy into a binding rule of conduct. Delegation is valid only when the legislative policy and guidelines to implement it are adequately laid down by the legislature and the delegate is only empowered to carry out the policy within the guidelines laid down by the legislature. What is permitted therefore is the delegation of ancillary or subordinate legislative functions or what is frictionally called a power to fill up the details. The constitutional limits on delegation have been laid down, but still wide powers are being delegated. So, what becomes important is control mechanisms on exercise of delegated legislative power. Now, let us see what are the control mechanism on exercise of this delegated legislative power. The control mechanism of administrative rule making comprise three components, namely parliamentary control, procedural control and judicial control, which has become the most important. Every delegate is subject to the authority and control of the principal. Hence, the parliamentary control over delegated legislation is a living continuity and constitutional necessity. The parliamentary control is exercised through the process of laying. The tabling of the delegated legislation before parliament is called as laying. There are no general law for laying of rules in India. However, the rules were required to be laid before the parliament as soon as may be before their publication. The rules are to be laid and subject to modification as the Parliament might make. Rules are required to be laid for specific period before their publication and either required approval of the Parliament or could be annulled by the Parliament. This is known as laying with affirmative or negative procedure. The second kind of control exercised by Parliament is through committees. There are committees on subordinate legislation of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha which have been authorized to examine all orders whether laid on the table of the House or not and make recommendations toward making delegated legislation more responsive. The second kind of a control over delegated legislation is procedural control. Procedural control ensures effective vigil over rule making, guarantee effective people participation, acceptance and effectivity of the rules. It has 4 components: antecedent publicity, drafting of the rules, consultation with the affected parties, and finally notification and publication of the rules so that they are known to the public in general before they become the effective. And the third kind of a control which is being exercised is through the judiciary, which is known as judicial control or judicial review of the administrative rule making. This judicial review of administrative rule making is subject to normal rules governing the review of administrative action, and the validity of rules can be challenged if the Parent Act provides for that the rule shall not be called in question in any court of law. In judicial review, the courts can examine the delegated legislation on a number of points, like where the Parent Act is unconstitutional, where Parent Act delegates essential legislative functions, where delegated legislation is inconsistent with the Parent Act, where delegated legislation is inconsistent with general law of the land, where delegated legislation is unconstitutional or arbitrary or unreasonable or malefied, where delegate further delegates which is not authorized by the Parent Act, known as subdelegation, where delegated legislation excludes power of judicial review of courts. So, with this I come to the end of this session on administrative rule making and control mechanism over it, and leave you with a brief quiz on the topic which you will find easy, and thank you for watching the video.